Good morning, students. Back to the lectures on postcolonialism. So, as you know, it's been a long journey from colonialism. We looked into different concepts, starting from colonialism. We moved to imperialism. We traced the history of colonialism. We tried to define colonialism. And then we moved to imperialism. And then we talked about the emergence of Commonwealth literatures. Later, we discussed the theories of colonial discourses, mainly that of Franz Fanon, Edward Said, and then we turned to theory, which happened in 1980s, and we discussed these concepts like rereading English canons, different ways of reading, rereading English canons and reading against the grain, etc. And now we come to the tail end of post-colonial studies. We have reached Empire Writes Back. So this is the third form of literary analysis produced by the turn to theory, which brought together some of the insights gained by theories of colonial discourses with readings of the new literatures from countries with a history of colonialism. So we use the work of Franz Fanon and Edward Said and later Baba, Homi Baba and Spivak. And it became popular to argue that these texts were primarily concerned with what is known as writing back to the sender. And these texts actively engaged in a process of questioning all those colonial discourses in their work. The nomenclature, we have discussed all these points. The nomenclature of Commonwealth was dropped in preference of post-colonial in describing these writers and their work as if to signal a new generation of critics, rejection of older attitudes in preference of the newer, more interdisciplinary approaches. So this imperious overtones of Commonwealth literature fell out of favor from the 1980s, and in stark contrast to liberal humanist readings by critics of Commonwealth literature, the post-colonial literatures were regarded as politically radical and locally situated rather than universally relevant. So we have discussed these points when we discussed the emergence of Commonwealth literature. And post-colonial literatures were deemed to pose direct challenges to the colonial sender from the colonized margins, negotiating new ways of seeing that both contested the dominant mode and gave voice and expression to colonized and once colonized peoples. So, post-colonial literatures actually were actively engaged in the act of decolonizing the mind. And this approach was crystallized in an important book that appeared at the end of the decade titled The Empire Writes Back: Theory and Practice in Post-Colonial Literatures, which came out in 1989. It was co-authored by three critics from Australia. It is Bill Ashcroft, one is Bill Ashcroft, the other Gareth Griffiths and Helen Tiffin. And it was inspired, the title was inspired by Salman Rushdie's argument concerning the need to decolonize the English language. So this text, The Empire Writes Back, brings out the issues we have been exploring into a coherent critical practice. It actually epitomized the increasingly popular view that literature from the once colonized countries was fundamentally concerned with the challenging language of colonial power and unlearning its worldview and producing new modes of representation. Its authors looked at the fortunes of the English language in countries with a history of colonialism, noting how writers were expressing their own sense of identity by refashioning English in order to enable it to accommodate their experiences. So their English was being displaced by these are the lines from the text. Different linguistic communities in the post colonial world. English was being displaced by different linguistic communities in the post colonial world who were actually remaking it as an attempt to challenge the colonial value system. So, in a tone often more prescriptive than descriptive, this text tried to express the belief that the crucial function of language as a medium of power demands that post-colonial writing define itself by seizing the language of the sender, replacing it in a discourse fully adapted to a colonized place. So these are the lines from the text. So it understood that the function of language is to is to seize post-colonial writing. The major aim of post-colonial writing is to seize the language of the sender and replace it with something which is adapted to their own place, their own identity. And according to them, this refashioning worked in several ways. Ashcroft, Griffiths, and Tiffin claimed that writers were actually creating new Englishes. There is this lack of capital E, which is very deliberate. It is small letter E and Englishes. It tries to say that it tries to remove that dominant attitude. Along with that, it tries to say that there are multiple forms. There is not a single English, dominant English. There are multiple forms of English and it is translated as, it is given as Englishes. So, according to the authors of Empire Writes Back, they try to tell that the writers from these regions were creating new Englishes through various strategies. And these are their strategies. One includes one include inserting untranslatable words into their text by glosing seemingly obscure terms, by refusing to follow standard English syntax, using structures derived from local languages, using creolized versions of English, and also subverting the standard English. So each of these strategies demonstrated operating in a variety of post-colonial texts, and in each the emphasis was on the writer's attempt to subvert and refashion standard English into various new forms of English. For example, The Empire Writes Back asserted that post colonial writing was always written out of the of abrogation is actually discontinuing of the received English, which speaks from the sender, and an act of appropriation. It is actually seizure, or which brings it under the influence of a vernacular tongue. The new English of the colonized place was ultimately different from the language at the colonial center, separated by an unbridgeable gap. So these are the lines from the text. This absence or gap is not negative but positive in its effect. It presents the difference through which an identity can be expressed. It is through the difference that the post-colonial identity is being expressed. So the new Englishes couldn't could not be converted into standard English because they have moved beyond its limits and it has already broken its rules, which is given by the standard English. And as a result of this differences, new values, identities, and value systems, the whole old colonial values are wholeheartedly rejected. And it was widely, this singular book was widely influential in the discussions of post-colonial literature in university classrooms in the early 1990s, and it made a valuable contribution to literary studies in this field. It shifted the approach to literatures from the once colonized nations away from the abstract issue of a text universal and timeless value and towards a more politicized approach which analyzed text primarily within historical and geographical context. For Ashcroft, Griffiths, and Tiffin, postcolonial writing challenged generally held views about values rather than confirming them. Their local concerns, for them, the local concerns were fundamental to their meanings and it is not of secondary importance. However, there were many criticisms against this book. The chief one being that it is remarkably totalizing in its representation, it is generalizing its representation, and it is trying to give out a grand theory. So there are mainly three criticisms against this book. One is about the gender differences. Critics say that the Empire Writes Back neglects gender differences between writers. So how does gender impact on these issues? So there is this Anne McClintock who says in an essay, The Angel of Progress, Pitfalls of the Term Postcolonialism. She tries to say that women and men do not live in postcoloniality in the same way. So this must affect a writer's relationship to language. And the criticism was like this particular book, did not account for the gender differences in their theory of the uses of language in post-colonial text. Exactly the same is said about the class differences too. Important social facts of a writer's identity are passed over by the authors in an attempt to isolate an identifiable common mode of postcolonial theory. So they were trying to generalize, and that is also mentioned, that is also a criticism when they talk about the concept of nation. They say that critics say that there is little attempt to differentiate within or between writings from divergent nations. So national differences are also not accounted for. So they ignore these questions like, did colonialism happen in the same manner in divergent locations? Questions like, can we assume that the writing from the countries with different historical and cultural relationships with the sender functions in the same way? What status would we give to the writings of Maori people in New Zealand or the First Nations people of the American subcontinent who might view white settler communities more as a neo-colonial than post-colonial? So these differences between the concerns of different nations are not accounted for. And the third one is writing back, really prevalent. So there are some critics who have voiced their concern with the assumption that all writing from one's colonized locations is writing against colonial discourses. Arun P. Mukherjee, in his essay Who's Post-Colonial and Who's Postmodernism, tries to say, these are the words, leaves us only one modality, one discursive position. We are forever forced to interrogate European discourses of only one particular kind, the ones that degrade and deny our humanity. I would like to respond that our cultural productions are created in response to our own needs. So they are trying to bring out the view that not all writings are concerned, not all writings coming from these nations are concerned with decolonizing the mind. So the issues surrounding colonialism and post-colonialism can be only or maybe only one part of wider set of concerns. And it is vitally important to be clear at the beginning of our readings that we do not assume that, as I said, that all writings from these part meant to be something concerned with decolonizing the mind. So these are the three criticism against this work. One, it didn't take into account the gender difference. Second, it didn't take into account national differences. And third one, not every writing is particularly attached to these concerns. Thus, for all its good intentions, Empire Writes Back ultimately created as many problems as it is solved. So it created problems. So, at one point, we thought that it gave us the complete solution to postcolonial studies, but it also created another set of problems. But we should understand that it is the single text by Ashcroft, Griffiths, and Tiffin which brought together a diverse and plural body of literatures from many places, though it neglected to think carefully about the differences between the literatures they examine and book actually created a grand theory of postcolonialism which ignored the historical and cultural differences between writers. It completely denied diversity and variety. But as I said earlier, this is the book which brought together different writings, brought together pluralistic body, plural body of literatures into the study. So that's Empire Writes Back. Now we mention postcolonialism at the millennium, that is from 1990s. It became increasingly busy and academically fashionable area of study, and here we see a peculiar splitting of the field, that there is this, on one side there is this all those critical work which explores post-colonial theory, and on the other side we have all those textual criticisms of post-colonial literatures. So as we saw, this work, The Empire Writes Back, brought together all those theoretical insights to bear on readings of post-colonial text, and that comes in the first part, and in the second part with the recent years of Holy Trinity of Edward Said, Spivak and Baba. The focus has been on the textual criticisms, but we should say that collectively both these approaches collectively helped in creating what is known as post-colonial theory. And the most useful surveys of post-colonial theory tend to be collection of essays rather than critical text. So these are the collection of essays you should remember which contributed to this study of post-colonial theory. One is Colonial Discourse and Post-Colonial Theory, edited by Patrick Williams and Laura Chrisman, which features extracts from the work of Holy Trinity as well as many other important voices. And we have this Post-Colonial Studies reader by the same authors, Ashcroft, Griffith and Tiffin, and gives short extracts from longer pieces. There is this another collection, Colonial Discourse, Post-Colonial Theory by Francis Baker and Margaret Iverson, which includes several essays which question many of the key assumptions of post-colonial theory. And there is White Mythologies, Writing History and the West by Robert Young, which offers useful explanations of the works of the Holy Trinity and situates their work within a wider exploration of post-structuralist approaches to history. We have the work of Bartmore Gilbert, Postcolonial Theory, which gives perhaps the fullest and richest work to date on postcolonial theory, and it also usefully situates it in relation both to Commonwealth literature and works of other postcolonial writers. And we have this work, An Introduction to Postcolonial Theory by Peter Childs and Patrick Williams. It is certainly the most stimulating in dealing with these three authors, Spivak, Baba and Edward Said. And we have Annie Lumba's Colonialism, Postcolonialism. So my lectures are mainly based on that text, Colonialism, Postcolonialism by Annie Lumba, which is detailed and mostly concerned with colonial rather than post-colonial representations, and we have Leela Gandhi's post-colonial theory, a critical introduction, which gives a synoptic view of post-colonial theorists. And after that, we have a more recent critical activity is more closely associated with the cultural and historical specifics of literature from particular locations in the light of important theoretical developments. We have South African literatures by Michael Chapman and strategic transformations in Nigerian writing, another work. So these kinds of recent critical activities tries to concentrate on specific locations, and it has been very important area in post-colonialism. And when we try to define post-colonialism, what how can we define post-colonialism and the dangers behind it? So we have discussed all these points, like before defining post-colonialism, we need to know what is colonialism. We have tried to discuss all these things, how colonialism gives out, or theories of colonial discourses, how they argue that colonialism affect modes of representation, how language carries certain assumptions that this is a proper way of seeing things, something language teaches, something is true, something is real. And we also discussed this point that post-colonialism doesn't start with the end of colonialism. It is not like hoisting of a new independent flag which brings out a new era, a new historical era. It is not something like that. So basically, post-colonialism involves the challenge to colonial ways of knowing, writing back in opposition to such views. And it also raises the issue of internal colonialism. We have discussed all these points. So the term post-colonialism is not same as after colonialism, as if the colonial values are no longer to be reckoned with. It does not define a radically new historical era, nor does it herald a brave new world where all the ills of the colonial past have been cured. Rather, we should understand postcolonialism as both historical continuity and change. On one hand, it acknowledges that the material realities and the modes of representation common to colonialism are still very much with us today, even if the political map of the world has changed through decolonization. So it still remains. We should understand that. We should accept that. And but on the other hand, it asserts the promise, the possibility, and the continuing necessity of change, while also recognizing that important challenges and changes have already been achieved. So, with this firmly in our minds, we can proceed to make some decisions about what is gathered under our umbrella term post colonialism. So, very basically, and in a literary context, post colonial involves one or more of the following. It involves, we have discussed all these things, reading text produced by writers from countries with a history of colonialism, primarily those texts concerned with the workings and legacy of colonialism, in either the past or the present. Second, reading text produced by those who have migrated from countries with a history of colonialism or those descended from migrant families which deal in the main with diaspora experiences and its many consequences. Third, in the light of theories of colonial discourses, we need to reread texts produced during colonialism, both those that directly address the experiences of empire and those that seem not to. So we have discussed all these points earlier too. So, excuse me, a central term in each of these things, each of these ways, it is reading. So, the act of reading in post-colonial context is by no means a neutral activity. How we read is just as important as what we read. So, as we go through all these lectures, the ideas we encounter within postcolonialism and the issues they raise demand that conventional reading methods and models of interpretation need to be rethought. So, rethinking conventional modes of reading is fundamental to postcolonialism. So, this is not like generalizing everything. I should say that it is impossible as well as wrong to unify these three areas into a single coherent postcolonialism with a common manifesto. There is nothing like a single sentence definitions. It is impossible and unwise to give a single sentence definition for postcolonialism because just like any other area of study, postcolonialism is also diverse and heterogeneous. And this is the one last word of warning. Postcolonialism may well aim to oppose colonial representations and values, but whether it fulfills these aims remain a hotly debated issue in the field. Postcolonialism may bring new possibilities, but it is also not free from problems of its own. So, in beginning postcolonialism, it is important that we maintain an element of suspicion, an element of doubt too. So, here we come to the end of the lectures on postcolonialism. So, as I said earlier, it's been a long journey. So, the only thing I would ask from you is to do all those external reading. Don't stick to these lectures alone. Please do your own work. Read. I have listed some of the works when I discussed collection of essays. Text, I discussed Leela Gandhi's work, Ania Lumba's work, and there is this Cambridge introduction. So please go through these texts and collect points, which is valuable, and make your study more rich. So thank you, girls. Have a nice day.